Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I wanted to share my story on how I got into horror, a horror film in particular. So when I think about how I got into horror film, I think back to my days in secondary school. For those of you who are unfamiliar with secondary school, in Ireland it's basically a combination of middle school and high school, so you do all 6 years in one school rather than going from one school to another. Anyway, I was in secondary school and I had a developing interest in watching films for multiple reasons, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. But something that I bought at the time was this book. Now this book, it's outdated at this point. I believe the last entry in this is 2003, but there's a lot of very interesting movies listed in this book, and I remember kind of perusing it and taking a look at everything and seeing, what seemed interesting and learning about these movies. But there was one entry in particular that caught my eye, and that, my friends, is the page on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This page here. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I was interested in this particular entry. Of course, the name itself kind of is very attention-grabbing. I'm not aware of the film at the time. It evoked a lot of very interesting images. But in particular, what interested me was this picture. So even though I hadn't watched horror movies basically at all by that point, the image itself I recognized. And if you're wondering how I recognize that, it's because of the trope of the killer with the hockey mask and the chainsaw. Obviously a combination of Jason Voorhees and Leatherface. But of course the chainsaw stood out more to me than the actual hockey mask. And if you're wondering some of these examples that I'd come across, one of course is in The Simpsons, in season 5 I believe, in which Homer tries to show his new hockey mask and chainsaw to Bart. Then another was in Final Fantasy VII. I believe it's one of the forms that Vincent can transform into. I can't remember if it was his second form or his third form, but being a huge Final Fantasy fan, you can imagine that seemed particularly interesting to me, particularly since I believe the strategy guide for Final Fantasy VII said that the transformation should be quite recognizable, which always intrigued me. And then, oddly enough, and this is probably the most surprising of all of them, there is a movie, I believe it was a direct-to-video movie, I could be wrong on this. It was Tiny Toons Vacation or something like that. And there is actually a storyline in which there is a guy, a hitchhiker, which for those who have seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre will mean something, who is clearly unhinged or delusional or there's problems with him. And eventually he does actually wear a hockey mask and chase one of the characters with a chainsaw, which is very interesting. So seeing this image from this book, I immediately recognized that this was the figure that all these had been referencing, that this was some big pop culture icon. And as you'll probably learn about me, when I see that something has permeated popular culture to the point where something should be recognizable, that's when I become intrigued. So I really wanted to watch this movie, this Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, and to know the backstory behind this icon, this figure. Now at the same time, I was trying to develop my interest not just in horror, but in kind of all fields of film. I wanted to see more movies, and there was a couple of reasons for that. One reason, and this might sound a bit sad to you guys, but it was to help improve my social experiences. Basically, a lot of my interests at the time were so niche and kind of specialist that for most people that I ended up talking to, I couldn't really communicate anything to them. I couldn't really discuss anything because everything that I was interested in, they had no ideas about, and they weren't particularly interested in listening to me. So beyond simply becoming interested in movies, I was also interested in watching more movies so that I'd have more kind of conversation topics to talk to people. If I'm watching some of the greatest movies of all time, other people are likely to have seen them, and then I can actually discuss something with them. But beyond that, there was many other reasons. But one particular day, I came across a list, and that list is this. It's Empire Magazine's 500 Greatest Movies of All Time. And I remember spending hours at the time creating this list, turning the list into a format in which I could mark off the movies that I'd seen. I even included a rating one, which I don't think I ever actually ended up using. But I found that well worth doing, and so I ended up diving into the world of film. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that this list is, perfect list by any means. It isn't. There are plenty of movies that I've seen on this list that I did not like. And conversely, there's many fantastic movies that I've seen that I think are amazing and brilliant that aren't included on this list. So it's certainly not definitive by any means, but it did prove to be very, very helpful to me. I discovered a lot of very good movies through this list, as well as many interesting genres. And a very interesting fact, I think, is that I started watching Studio Ghibli movies through this list, which then bloomed into my greater interest in anime and manga. But likewise, there were plenty of horror movies on this list. And of course, the very first one that I really, really wanted to see was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And after a mishap in which I ordered an American copy of the Blu-ray, which wouldn't run on my Blu-ray player, I ended up getting another copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and finally ended up watching the movie. And I know, like, a lot of people will find the Texas Chainsaw Massacre very tame by today's standards in terms of gore and violence and everything. But considering it was one of the first, if not the first, horror films that I saw, it left a very, very big impact on me. And from there, I ended up watching a lot of other horror movies that are included on this list. Movies like, for instance, Halloween, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, or Scream. And eventually, of course, I ended up wanting to find more horror movies beyond those that were included on this list. And that, of course, led to me finding some of my favorite horror movies ever. Just to give you one quick example, for instance, of a horror movie that I think is like one of the best I've ever seen, but isn't on this list, is The Devil's Rejects. I just absolutely love that movie. And from there, it's kind of been a bit all over the place. I remember very enthusiastically kind of gorging myself on all sorts of horror movies at the time, but after a while I did kind of get distracted by other things, such as anime, such as manga, such as reading prose, such as playing video games, etc, etc, that I kind of left horror on the back burner. I did watch horror movies occasionally and really enjoyed them when I did, but I wasn't anywhere near as frequently as before. And then in 2020, I ended up rewatching Cabin in the Woods, which blew me away again. I hadn't watched it for many years, and I watched it and I was like, oh my god, this is incredible. And since then, I've been very enthusiastically watching horror films. I've been expanding my collection, finding more films, whether they be horror classics or more recent releases that I absolutely love and adore. And eventually it inspired me to create this channel because I wanted to share my passion for the horror genre and to be able to discuss these movies with more people. So that's my story of how I discovered horror, of how I came to love it, etc, etc. Of course, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on all this. Did you find the story particularly interesting? How did you discover horror? What are your thoughts on the fact that I was intrigued by this pop culture figure? And of course, if you have any additional information about horror movies, about these lists, about anything, please leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase horror DVDs, horror books, etc, etc, through those affiliate links, not only are you supporting me, not only are you supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the horror industry. So I would highly encourage you to use my Amazon affiliate links to purchase your horror. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye bye.